Welcome back to this Beginner's Guide to Unity series. In the last episode we installed Unity, we installed VS Code, and we installed a version of Unity onto the Unity Hub. In this episode we're going to take a look at making the project, and we're going to set up and have a look around the inspector and all of the elements that make a project. So once you have a version installed, we're going to go to the Projects menu, and we're going to press New to create a new project. From here you're given a bunch of different options. I always tend to choose a 3D project to make, and I always kind of justify that with the metaphor of driving the car. So when you do a driving test, you can either do a test for a manual car or an automatic car. If you do a manual test, you can drive both an automatic and a manual car. But if you only do an automatic test, you can only drive an automatic car and not drive a manual. And I kind of see the same with a 3D project. A 3D project has all of the same features that a 2D project also has, but you also have more freedom than just making a 2D project. So you can make a 2D project in a 3D environment, but you can't make a 3D project in a 2D environment. So I tend to always choose a 3D project just because it gives you that more freedom. So let's select 3D project and let's choose a project name. I'm going to call this, for example, my first project, and then we can choose a location. I'm happy with that, and we can press create. We'll have to give it a minute so that Unity can initialize everything, so set up all of the packages, tools, and everything that we need to see the game. And in a few moments it should launch, so let's just wait for that to happen. Once Unity launches, you should see something that is very, very similar to this UI here. This is essentially Unity. It may look very daunting at first, but a lot of this will become second nature to you at some point, and you will just know exactly what you're doing. But for now, we're going to take it easy. We're going to go step by step, and we're going to break down every component that is in this scene right now. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to have a look at the scene view. That's the main view that you should see. If you don't, it's likely that you're selected on Game or Asset Store, so make sure that you've clicked on Scene. If your layout for some reason doesn't look like this, you can always go to Window, you can go to Layouts, and then you can press Default. When I can hover it, Default. And that should reset your layout to look like this. Within the scene view, you should notice that we have kind of this big middle box here. This is your 3D environment, and you are kind of the spectator. So the way I like to imagine it is that your scene view is the behind the scenes of your game, and the game view is kind of what your player will see when they play the game. So let's focus on the scene view for now, and we can navigate it by holding down the right mouse button and moving the mouse around. This will allow us to pivot the camera from our point, so we're not actually moving, we're just rotating, and we're looking around in different directions. If this was a 2D environment, we'd only see a 2D screen, but because we're on a 3D environment, we have a whole 3D plane to mess around with. If we continue holding the right mouse button, and we also use the WAS and D keys, we can then also move the camera around. One thing that you might notice that I actually don't like that much about the new version of Unity is that your camera will slowly accelerate and decelerate as you move it around. If you like this, amazing. If you're like me and you don't, then you can press this camera icon and you can disable camera easing and camera acceleration, which to me just feels a lot more natural, and it's how I'm used to with older versions of Unity, so that's kind of why I keep this. As you can see in front of us, there are currently two objects. We have what looks to be a camera and what looks to be like the sun. And in fact, these are the two items and two objects that are currently in the scene. So if we head over to our hierarchy and open sample scene, I don't know why it was closed, you can see here that we have the main camera, which is this element, and we have directional light, which is this element. And we can do whatever we like with these elements. They're not permanently there. If you want, we can delete both of them. I'm going to press Ctrl Z or Command Z to undo that, but everything here you can play around with. This is your environment. And what I'm going to do to illustrate how this works is I'm actually going to add a new object into this scene view. So the way you can do this is you can either go to GameObject, 3D Object, and we're going to add a cube. Alternatively, we can right-click on the hierarchy under the scene. We can highlight over 3D Object, and we can press Cube. This will spawn a cube in as well into the scene. This cube is just like any of the other objects in the scene, so we have here the directional light, we have the camera, and we have the cube. You may notice that as we click on these objects, this side section here changes to update to match what we've currently clicked on. So for example, if we click on the light, we can see that it's got a transform value, or a component, and it has a light component attached. If we click on the camera, we can see that it has a transform value, and it has a camera component attached, as well as an audio listener. If we click on the cube, we can see that it has a mesh filter, a mesh renderer, and a box collider attached, as well as the default shader, which is currently empty. What we can do with the objects in the scene is we can move them around and we can craft them to look however we'd like. So for example, if we want this cube to be over in this, let's say this corner over here, we can ensure that we're on the move tool by either clicking this tool up here or pressing W on your keyboard, clicking on the cube, and then moving the blue arrow, which is our Z value, moving the red arrow, which is our X value, or moving the green arrow, which is our Y value. So we can put that wherever we like in the scene. If you want to have a little bit less control over how you move it and have more specific movements, you can hold down the arrow, you can hold Control, and then you can start pulling, which will move it by 1 centimeter increments every single time. And you can change how the increment works in the Unity settings, but we're going to keep it at the default for now. If you want to reset the position of the cube, the easiest way to do so is to head to the transform, and you can either type in 0, 0, 0, which is the world origin, or, let's just move this away, you can right click on the transform, and you can also click reset position. If you want to freely move the cube, you can see that there's kind of these 3 boxes in the center of the cube. So if I drag that around, we're now moving it on both the X and the Z axis, while still paying respect to the Y. So our Y axis never changes here. We're just moving it along the X and the Z. And if I hold Control, you can see that it's a little bit more tacky, but if you look in the inspector here, the values that it gives us are complete integer values. They aren't decimals like this. So that's one way you can have more control over your movement. Another tool that we can use is the rotation. So if we go over here and we press the rotate tool, you can also press E on your keyboard to select that automatically, we will now be greeted with some spheres that outline the cube. So these spheres determine the rotation and the direction that we'll be rotating. So for example, you can see that the blue line will allow us to rotate in this direction, the red line will allow us to kind of turn it over on top of itself, and the green line will allow us to turn it over in this direction, and that's because we're moving the cube, so the lines are moving as well. Alternatively, we can move the cube by holding down the lines and pressing the Control key, as we did before, and you can see that we now have more control over its rotation. So if you want to perfectly rotate something by 90 degrees, so let's for example reset the rotation, hold down the green, hold down Control, and then we turn this by 90 degrees. There we go. You can't really see the handle very well here. What if I go from the top view and then we hold Control? You can see that now we can rotate the cube in 90-degree formats, and this kind of grid will allow you to understand how much you're rotating it by. So we've just done a full circle there and everything's right back to 0. All of these values are between 0 and 360, so if I set this to 800, it will be allowed, but generally that's no different to setting it to, for example, 300. If you want a little bit more control over the rotation of your game object, you can also move the mouse right into the center of it and just drag by holding the left mouse button down, so I'm not releasing the left mouse button, and you can drag freely along all axes. And then we can just simply reset the rotation by right-clicking the transform and setting reset rotation. Finally, one other crucial transform tool that we have is the scale tool, which is right next to rotation, or you can press R on your keyboard. Very similarly to the arrows we had for the move tool, we now have these kind of cubes that look like you can pull them, and you can pull them. And if you pull them, you can see that we're changing the dimensions of the game object depending on the axis that we're choosing. So if we wanted to, for example, make this into a floor, we could make this very small, we could make this very big, and then suddenly we have a floor that we could put maybe some chairs on, or a table, or a character model, or anything like that. Alternatively as well, if you want to have more control, you can hold it down, press Control, and then I'm moving it in 1 centimeter increments again. This doesn't only apply to the cube that we've added. This applies to anything we add to the scene, as well as everything that's already there. So for example, if we want to change the directional light, which in this case is representing the sun, we can rotate that by selecting the rotate tool, pressing E, and then rotating it. And as you can see, as we rotate the sun, we get this kind of day-night cycle as we rotate it, which is how many games actually do a day-night cycle in Unity. They just have the sun rotate like this. And you can see that not only is the sun moving, so you can see it there, but also the shadows on the plane as well, on this cube that we've made, are also moving. So here you can get some very, very nice angles. One thing that's different with a directional light, however, is that moving its position will not make any difference, because it's essentially a sun. We'll have a look at other lights and other components later on in this course, but for now, rotating it is all you need to worry about. When we click on the camera, not only do we have access to move the camera, rotate the camera, and all of that, we also have this camera preview window here. So if I click on Game, you can see that this is currently what that camera sees, which is what's represented in this camera preview. So let's say, for example, we wanted to have a more top-down view of this plane. Well, let's move the camera closer to it. Let's lift the camera up a bit, maybe a bit further back. Then we can go to the Rotate tool, and we can drag the camera down. So now if we go to the game view, this is what you would see when you launch the game, the executable file. We now have this camera that's looking at a plane. So for example, maybe you could make a chess game or a checkers game with this kind of camera angle. Anything is possible. One practice that's always good to get into when doing a project in Unity is to name things. So if we click on this cube here, it's not really a cube anymore, we've deformed it. So what we should do is we should go here and we should rename it to maybe plane, because it's more similar to a plane. Or maybe we should call it a floor. So we can either rename it again here, or we can head to the hierarchy, we can click on rename, and we can type floor. Alternatively, if you click once, you should be able to rename it this way as well, or you can just rename it from here like everything else. And there is a lot to explore in this hierarchy, this inspector window, that we won't go through too much detail, but I'll kind of walk you through how everything works. So let's add another game object, let's add another cube, and let's recenter that in the scene. So that's now exactly in the center. Let's move it on top of the plane by moving to our Move tool and dragging it up. So now we have this cube that's on top of a plane. So if we go to our scene view, you can see that very clearly. But what happens when I change the directional light so that the sun is maybe, let's say, directly down? Suddenly it's getting a bit more hard to see that we have two objects here. The white of the cube and the white of the plane are blending into one another, and it's making it very, very difficult to tell the difference. This is where our project window comes into play. This is where any assets, so for example sprites, other scenes, 3D character models, materials, textures, any part of the game, something that you would maybe find in your file browser, in your computer, so in your documents folder, is all stored here. So what we can do here is we can create a material. A material can then be attached to one of these, and the material will control its color and how it reacts to light. So let's head back to the scene view. Let's click off everything, and let's right click on the assets. Let's head right to the top where it says create, and you'll see there is a bunch of stuff that we can create. We'll eventually, through many YouTube videos, probably go through all of these, but for now the one thing that we would like to create is a material. So let's create a new material, and let's give it a name of, for example, cube, because it's going to be the material for our cube. Now what we can do is we can take this cube material, and we can either drag it directly onto the cube, or we can drag it onto the cube in the hierarchy as well. And you should see that kind of add icon show up. And you might be thinking now, what's changed? Everything looks identical. And that's because the albedo, or the color of this cube, is white. So we can go into this color picker, we can choose any color, so let's for example say blue, and we can now in real time change the color of this cube. So maybe a darker color so that we can see it more clearly. Then in the game view you can see that it's so much easier to see this cube now because we've added this material, this color to it. This also works the exact same way if you want to add a texture to anything. You just need to drag in and import the file, usually it's a PNG file, into Unity. Then you can drag that file onto the game object and it will have that texture. We can also use the same material, same texture, on multiple things. So let's drag this cube one onto the floor. So now we're using the same material on two different game objects, and if we change the color of it, you can see that both of them update as well. So let's go ahead and let's make a new material for the floor. So let's make a new material, let's call it floor, and let's drag that onto here as well. So now we can go ahead and change the color of this. So let's say, for example, what would be a nice color to have here? Maybe kind of grey, a light grey, so it's not too white, but it's not dark enough to blend in with the cube. And there we have it. We now have two colors that stand out on top of each other, and we suddenly can see a lot more going on in this scene. At the same time, we maybe want to rename this cube to be something more. For example, we could call this our player. And then we can have the player, we can have some scripts in the future perhaps that would make the player move along this floor, and then if they fall off it's game over, and we can have some physics. But first I'd like to just spend a few moments discussing what else is attached to these 3D cubes, because essentially these are still cubes, we've just deformed them a little bit. So you can see here the very first thing next to the player is this checkbox. If we uncheck it, the player suddenly goes invisible. We haven't deleted the player from our scene, we've simply turned it off, it's not being rendered anymore, we can't view it. But you can see that it's still in our hierarchy, so we haven't deleted it. And if we click on it, we still have all of the abilities that we had before, and we can actually still move it around. It's just invisible. So then if we tick player again, we can put it back. So for example, maybe you want to make a game where when you pick up a coin, it will make the coin disappear for 20 seconds and then the coin comes back again. Well, instead of spending all this time and memory usage on and deleting it from memory and then respawning it back, we could just make it disappear. And then in 20 seconds time, it can reappear and the player can collect it again. As we go down, we can see the transform, which we've discussed in great detail before. We also have the mesh filter, which works with the mesh renderer. So the mesh renderer is essentially what you can see. It's this cube object. If we turn off the mesh renderer, you can still see the outline, but you can't see the mesh anymore. And the reason for that is because the mesh renderer is responsible for displaying the mesh, the graphics of the cube. So if we keep that mesh renderer enabled, you can see that. And we can mess around with some of these as well. So if we turn off receive shadows, no longer will shadows from other objects, so for example if we duplicate the player and put them up here, no longer will any shadows from other objects be cast onto this object. And then if we put receive shadows back on, you can see that it now receives shadows again. If we turn cast shadows off, we have the opposite, and this object no longer casts a shadow. And this is how the mesh renderer works with the lighting system. Additionally, we have a box collider, but we're actually going to discuss physics in the next video. I hope this video has given you a very brief introduction to the Unity UI. I hope that you have a little play around before the next video, adding elements, adding materials, changing the colors of things. If you do have any questions, let me know, but otherwise I'll see you in the next video.